You've just spoken to a very senior journalist who wants to upend this very long-standing model of journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. So tell us who he is and what he wants you and I gather every other journalist, to actually do.
Well, his name is Ulrich Hagerup, and Ulrich was at the very top of his profession in his native Denmark. He was the director of news at the national broadcaster, and he quit his job. In 2017, he set up a thing called the Constructive Institute. He says then ask these two words: now what? What do you do about that problem? And his whole point is that we need to be providing stories about solutions, what works. That cities and countries, towns around the world have similar problems. How did the people in the next town fix their problem? This is an interesting question, and the readers are interested in. That's the sort of approach that he wants to popularise.
For the last 54 years, countless writers have lived by the words of the late author Graham Greene, who wrote that writers should have a splinter of ice in the heart. He meant that we need to maintain a critical distance from the events we cover in order to remain objective. But have journalists become part of the world's problems with our focus on catastrophes? Today, international and political editor Peter Hartcher on the argument that some journalists have been bad friends to all of you, and the clarion call for a new type of writing to meet this moment of calamity that we find ourselves in. So, Peter, you start your piece by referring to the old journalism adage, if it bleeds, it leads. Now, you've been in the game for 40 plus years, so I'm dying to ask you just how much this rings true. When was the last time you wrote a happy story?
Well, of course it rings true. I mean, the broad concept is that what's going wrong in the world is what is news. There's no news in things that go right, generally speaking, and that's the rule by which our industry operates. The last time I wrote a positive story, apart from this one we're discussing today about constructive journalism, well, generally you and I talk about global catastrophes, and sadly there are too many going on. There's Donald Trump dismantling the world order. There's Vladimir Putin waging war against Europe. There's Xi Jinping waging the biggest military build-up we've seen since the Cold War and massively expanding China's nuclear stockpile. There's climate change, which continues to aggravate. And social media takes all of those existing problems and conflicts, magnifies them and intensifies arguments about everything and foments hatred and bitterness. And on top of that, we've now got new anxieties about what's going to happen with artificial intelligence. So this complex of crises, overlapping and interconnected, has been called the poly crisis or the pluri crisis, and it's going on around us. And it is an unusually fraught time in world affairs to have so much major crisis occurring at once. So in our business, Samantha, that just leads for a lot of pretty depressing, upsetting, yet realistic coverage. I do want to, however, give myself a tiny pat on the back, because when I saw you were going to ask this question, I looked back through my last 8 stories, like 8 columns. Of those, 7 have been either mildly positive or neutral, or actually quite hopeful. And that's largely because with the re-election of the Albanese government and the fact that they're about to convene a productivity roundtable to look for consensus-based ideas for improving our country and its economy, it is actually an unusual moment of hope, at least in Australian domestic affairs. But I'm not going to claim that all my work or 7/8 of it generally is positive. It's generally dealing as frankly and as analytically as possible with a lot of big problems.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you deserve a pat on the back, and I'll give you that one, because I certainly read your piece and I thought, well, I don't deserve one because, I often joke, well, I'm really fun at parties because I'm always focusing on the dark news, the catastrophes that are happening.
That's why you dance so well. It's to, offset that at parties.
Exactly. I have to because I'm so dark. But let's speak about the crux of your piece, because you've just spoken to a very senior journalist who wants to upend this very long-standing model of journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. So tell us who he is and what he wants you and I gather every other journalist to actually do.
Well, his name is Ulrich Hagerup, and Ulrich was at the very top of his profession in his native Denmark. He was the director of news at the national broadcaster, and he quit his job. In 2017, he set up a thing called the Constructive Institute in Denmark, in Copenhagen, with the revolutionary idea of trying to popularize and democratize constructive journalism, not just the sort that leaves us feeling a bit depressed and a bit exhausted.
Constructive journalism is neither a cookie-cutter toolkit for journalists to follow rigidly, nor is it happy, fluffy escapism. It is a set of ethical, consistent norms that allow for flexible journalistic innovation. It rests on 3 principles.
He says we are aiming to change the world's news culture. This is a very ambitious aim. He said we gave ourselves 5 years, but then the funding ran out, and we're now into years 8, 9, and we've got some more funding, and we're still hoping.
I loved it. And he had a particular, tip almost, or directive, to journalists, which is that we add a 2-word question. Whenever we write something and it's focusing on a problem, he's not saying we shouldn't focus on problems. He's saying absolutely, but he's saying we should add this 2-word question to our reporting. Tell us what he said, Peter.
Well, the 2 words, first you describe, analyze, document the problem, and that is the chief burden of what we do. We expose wrongdoing, we find the miscreants, we label the problem, we analyze them, and that is essential in any system, in any society. You have to identify a problem before you can fix it. If you can't fix a problem if you don't know it's there. So there is good social value in our what is bad news reporting. But he says then ask these 2 words. Now what? What do you do about that problem? And his whole point is that we need to be providing stories about solutions, what works. That cities and countries, towns around the world have similar problems. How did the people in the next town fix their problem? This is an interesting question, and the readers are interested in. That's the sort of approach that he wants to popularize.
And I wanted to ask you a very simple question, which is why does he want to change the focus of journalism? What's the problem here? And I might just lead you to give us the anecdote he told us about. He said that headline writers have become bad friends. So tell us what he meant by that, because I think it sort of points to what he thinks is a psychological impact of all of this sort of negative journalism.
Yes. Well, in broad, his point is that by simply bombarding people with news about what's going wrong and problems and crises, that we are, all of which, of course, is then aggravated by social media, whose algorithms intensify every conflict, aggravate audiences, and make profit from people's engagements with the most angry, bitter, and intense emotional disputes and frictions, that is destroying both democracy and destroying society. It can lead to a sense of despair that all there is are problems, and that the world just seems to get worse. Nothing is solvable, which breeds defeatism and cynicism. What's the point of participating in society or in a democracy? What's the point of being politically active if nothing is solvable and everything is just an endless series of crises and people bickering and arguing about it? As for the way that we in the news media can be bad friends to our audiences, says Ulrich Hagerup, what do you want in a friend? Do you want someone who calls you up all the time and says, the castle is on fire? Do you want somebody who complains to you about everything all the time? Do you want somebody who's trying to make money out of you? We are bad friends. he says, and we need to improve that. Is it possible? Look, I'll give you two anecdotes, including the one you're inviting me to tell you, the metaphor that he uses. Is this a utopian project, I said to him. Is this just impossible? And the example I gave him, we were sitting in a square in the middle of Copenhagen. There were hundreds of people walking past us. And I said, look, all these people getting on with their day, everything's fine. There's no news there. But if a couple of them start a fist fight, that's the news. How do you change that innate human interest in what's going wrong? His response was, he said, yeah, but what if everyone is fighting? And there's a few people not fighting. How have they done that? What are they doing right? That's intriguing. What's aberrant in that situation is intriguing. So the solutions-based journalism can actually, and especially in a world where more and more people are fighting and more things are going wrong, the aberration increasingly becomes what's going right and peaceful. Therefore, that's his point, that it is possible to turn around that conception of journalism always being about bad news. But the metaphor that he uses and that you're inviting me to offer here, Samantha, he says about 30 or 30 plus years ago, Denmark was invaded by the fast food industry. He said we saw hamburger joints, kebab shops, pizza shops everywhere, and a group of chefs, Danish chefs, were sitting around one day bemoaning this problem and what the hell's gone wrong with our industry and why is this stuff so successful? It's cheap, it's fast, but it's unhealthy. And they decided to do something about it, and their constructive approach was to start a restaurant called Noma. Noma quickly became famous. It became the case study in a whole new wave of quality. It's fine dining, but based on local quality ingredients and a bit of imagination and authentic food is the way that they put it. Chefs came from all around the world. They studied Noma, and it revolutionized the industry. And even McDonald's started, in Denmark at least, started offering gourmet burgers dreamt up by famous chefs, and they changed them over every now and then. So he said, is it possible to revolutionize an industry? The answer is yes. That's his metaphor.
Okay, so if I was to apply this to journalism, because I was thinking about, what he had told you, and I was thinking, okay, well, if we applied this, instead of, let's just take one of Donald Trump's crazier utterances from just this morning as we record this. He's been in Scotland, and he, of course, has ranted about windmills and how they're causing whales to wash ashore and die, which is false, as I understand it. Anyway, is the point that if we were to apply Ulrich's, parallel, that instead of reporting on that, which is arguably doesn't add anything, we could have something about how we could actually help save whales? Like, is that the journalistic equivalent? Instead of flooding the zone with, the junk food of journalism, which is Trump's rants, there could be something that actually could help.
Yes, and in fact, the mastheads that we work for, Samantha, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, have for some time now been running something called explainers, and that an opportunity like that is an opportunity to run an explainer. What is the effect of wind turbines? Do the whales bump into the wind turbines in the ocean and wash up dead on the beach? Goodness, how do they manage to navigate everything else in the ocean if they can't navigate a concrete pylon in front of them?
That's right. They could even really investigate Trump's claim that it makes them go loco. Sorry, I had to quote him there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your rigorous
Precision.
Journalistic accuracy there. So yes, these things do present opportunities for constructive journalism and for informing readers. So absolutely, there is an opportunity there. And can I add that the Constructive Institute that Ulrich Hagerup started in Denmark has now established an offshoot in Australia, in Melbourne, hosted by Monash University, run by, it's called the Constructive Institute Asia Pacific Hub, and it's run by Kate Tawney, who was the former news director for ABC, the national broadcaster in Australia.
And tell us what she told you about, I guess, why this type of journalism is so important, and I guess the impact that it's had on her, because like you said, she led the ABC for a long time, and she spoke to you about what impact it had on her to constantly be reporting on, quite catastrophic events, and then now to look at journalism through this perspective.
Well, yes, that she realised that it was exhausting and depressing audiences. And one consequence of that, apart from the effect you're having on them immediately, is that fewer and fewer people want to hear all that and are inclined to switch it off. So that was her conclusion. She offered a good anecdote, a good example of how another country's national broadcaster in Norway has started applying this constructive journalism approach. The national broadcaster in Norway, on its radio, has a regular political radio debate. And she said that they changed the format so that instead of just having politicians going head-to-head in a classic debate format with a winner and a loser, the producers now require that the two contestants come back at a later date with 3 points of agreement that they've managed to come to. And that this has completely changed the nature of the program. It's been really well received by listeners, and it's had a big impact. And that's one of I think there are more than 8 now major mastheads, news outlets in Germany and the Nordic countries that have started to implement constructive journalism in a systematic way.
Interesting. And so, Peter, I have to ask you, what do you think the chances are that journalists across the world might really take up this constructive journalism more broadly? And I guess, what's your perspective? Has this conversation with Ulrich been enough do you want to shift your own reporting even more than you have done?
Well, it's interesting. He has scattered these seeds. There are similar efforts underway. There's an Australian-based outfit called 360 Info, run by Andrew Jaspan, who was a former editor of The Age in Melbourne, that has a positive solutions-based approach to the material that they publish. There are other people in this area, people nibbling at it already. I talked to the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Bevan Shields, and he said, we've been tentative about it so far, but there is real audience interest and appetite for more solutions-based journalism, and he's clearly interested in trying to expand that. In the case of our news mastheads and the Constructive Institute, one of our reporters, Liam Mannix, went and did a course with the Constructive Institute, came back. It changed the way he approaches his journalism, and he's written a string of constructive stories looking at solutions, not just problems, including one about how train travel can help take emissions and some of the discomfort out of air travel. He's written another one about how a bloke went to see his doctor to get his knee replaced and discovered he didn't need his knee replaced at all, that there are other ways of treating knee pain, and that's, for blokes of my age, Samantha, that's particularly heartening news. But there is this popularizing, spreading concept. It can never replace and never will replace the hard news, the bad news, because, as I said, you need to know the problem before you can look for the solution. But it can certainly constructively contribute to society, democracy, and making our societies more functional.
And it is instructive, I think, that you mentioned Liam Mannix there, because your piece led me to ask Liam about his experience. Like you said, he actually took a course at this Constructive Journalism Institute in Denmark, and he told me, I said, well, what did you think about this before you went? And he said, actually, I was skeptical. I was quite skeptical. He said, I was concerned that they were naive about journalism and about what effective journalism was. And I said, oh, well, how do you feel now afterwards? And he said, he didn't use the word converted, but he essentially said, he really has changed his mind. He said, I was very compelled by the argument my father makes. His father apparently used to be an ABC manager and a journalist. And his perspective was that journalism should be a force of common good. And this is Liam speaking. I think a lot of the problems that we face in modern society are ones that require collective action to address. He said climate change is a perfect example. And he said he's really on board that. So do you feel the same? Because I feel like when I read your reporting, I've always felt that the subtext is that you have a strong feeling that we do have a responsibility as journalists to sort of help bring about, the common good. Or do I have that right, Peter?
Yes, I think so. And I think our country is in many ways a case study, a model, an example of how countries can be better, as well as obviously a country that's full of problems. Which country isn't? And I think that it is useful for ourselves. I mean, a country that becomes defeatist and forgets its advantages and its triumphs can't improve if you've given up before you've even started. So I've always thought it's important that we point out, celebrate our own many successes as one of the most functional, successful, prosperous and harmonious nations on planet Earth, and that we need always to keep in mind that when we are beset by problems, there are also solutions.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much this does spread, because after I read your piece, I was thinking of, there's that famous quote by the late author and journalist Graham Greene, and he had famously stated that every writer should possess, quote, a splinter of ice in the heart. And I think he didn't mean that in a cruel way. I think he meant that, we need to keep a critical distance from events that journalists report on in order to really sort of illuminate the public. But this sort of, I think, adds a different nuance, So it'll be interesting to see.
Indeed.
Thanks so much, Peter, for your time.
Pleasure, Samantha.